In 1590, English explorer John White returned to Roanoke Island after a 3-year absence, expecting to find the thriving colony he had left behind. Instead, he discovered nothing. 115 men, women, and children had vanished without a trace. The only clue? A single word carved into a wooden post: CROATOAN. Welcome to the Uncharted Path, where we explore history's greatest mysteries and uncover the truth behind the legends. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into America's oldest unsolved mystery, the disappearance of the Roanoke Colony. For over 400 years, the fate of the Lost Colony has baffled historians, archaeologists, and amateur detectives alike. Did they integrate with local Native American tribes? Were they massacred? Did they attempt a dangerous journey back to England? Or is the truth something far more extraordinary? Today we'll examine every piece of evidence, explore the most compelling theories, and reveal shocking new discoveries that might finally solve this centuries-old puzzle. But first, let's travel back to 1585 to understand how this mystery began. Before we embark on this journey together, if you love diving deep into history's greatest mysteries, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing you these in-depth investigations. To understand the mystery of the Lost Colony, we must first understand the ambitious, some would say foolhardy, vision that brought English settlers to this remote island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The year was 1584. England, under Queen Elizabeth I, was desperately trying to establish a foothold in the New World to compete with Spanish dominance. Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of the Queen, received a royal charter to establish a colony in the region the English called Virginia, named after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. But Raleigh had never set foot in America. His knowledge came from explorers like Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, who had returned with glowing reports of a land they described as the most plentiful, sweet, fruitful, and wholesome of all the world. The first attempt at colonization came in 1585, when Raleigh sent 107 men under the command of Ralph Lane to establish a military outpost on Roanoke Island. This wasn't meant to be a permanent settlement. It was a strategic base for privateering against Spanish ships and exploring the continent's riches. But the Lane colony was a disaster from the beginning. The colonists, mostly soldiers and gentlemen with no practical skills for survival, quickly found themselves in conflict with the local Algonquian peoples. Their leader, Wingina, initially welcomed the English but grew increasingly hostile as the colonists demanded more and more food and resources. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The colonists alienated their Native American neighbors through arrogance and violence. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread through the settlement. When Sir Francis Drake arrived with his fleet in June 1586, the desperate colonists abandoned Roanoke Island and returned to England. But Walter Raleigh wasn't ready to give up. He began planning a different kind of colony, not a military outpost, but a genuine settlement of families who would build a permanent English presence in the New World. This time he recruited 150 colonists, including women and children, entire families willing to risk everything for the promise of land and opportunity in America. They would be led by John White, an artist and explorer who had been with the Lane expedition and knew the challenges they would face. The plan was ambitious: establish a settlement dubbed the City of Raleigh on Chesapeake Bay. Roanoke Island was supposed to be just a temporary stop to resupply and pick up the 15 soldiers Ralph Lane had left behind to maintain England's claim to the territory. But when White's expedition arrived at Roanoke Island on July 22, 1587, they made a disturbing discovery. The 15 soldiers were gone. The fort was in ruins. Deer were grazing where buildings had once stood. Of the men left to guard England's foothold in America, they found only one thing: a single skeleton. The pilot of White's ship, Simon Ferdinando, claimed it was too dangerous to continue to Chesapeake Bay so late in the season. Whether through genuine concern for safety or secret instructions from Raleigh's enemies, Ferdinando refused to take the colonists any further. John White faced an impossible choice: abandon the mission entirely or establish his colony on an island where the previous settlement had already failed and where relations with the Native Americans had deteriorated to violence. He chose to stay. On August 18, 1587, as the colonists worked to rebuild the fort and establish their settlement, something extraordinary happened that would become central to the mystery that followed. John White's daughter, Eleanor, gave birth to a daughter, the first English child born in America. They named her Virginia Dare. Imagine John White's conflicted emotions as he held his granddaughter. Joy at this symbol of English hopes in the New World, mixed with growing anxiety about the colony's precarious situation. Food supplies were running low. The relationship with local tribes remained tense. Winter was approaching. The colonists made a fateful decision. John White would sail back to England with the next supply ship to bring back more colonists, more supplies, and more support from Raleigh. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a few months at most. On August 27, 1587, John White said goodbye to his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia, and the 114 other colonists who were counting on his swift return. As his ship disappeared over the horizon, he had no way of knowing that it would be 3 long years before he would see Roanoke Island again. And when he finally returned, every single person would be gone. John White's journey back to England should have taken a few months. Instead, it became a 3-year nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. White arrived in England in November 1587, expecting to quickly organize a relief expedition. Instead, he walked into a nation preparing for war. King Philip II of Spain was assembling the largest naval force in history, the Spanish Armada, to invade England and restore Catholic rule. Queen Elizabeth I issued a royal decree: no ship was to leave English waters, every vessel was needed for the defense of the realm. White pleaded with Raleigh, with government officials, with anyone who would listen. His daughter, his granddaughter, 115 English colonists were stranded in the wilderness with limited supplies, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The fate of England itself hung in the balance. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was finally defeated, but White's troubles were far from over. Raleigh, facing financial difficulties from his colonization efforts, had transferred his Virginia charter to a group of London merchants. These new investors were more interested in privateering and quick profits than in rescuing stranded colonists. White managed to secure passage on 2 small ships in 1588, but the captains were more interested in capturing Spanish treasure ships than in reaching Virginia. After a disastrous encounter with French warships that left White wounded and the mission abandoned, he returned to England empty-handed. Imagine White's anguish. While he fought bureaucrats and investors in London, what was happening to his daughter Eleanor, to baby Virginia, who would now be walking, talking, becoming a little person? Were they still alive? Were they safe? Were they waiting for him? Finally, in March 1590, White secured passage on a privateering voyage commanded by John Watts. The 3-ship fleet agreed to make a stop at Roanoke Island, though their primary mission was raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. The journey was plagued with delays. First, they spent months in the Caribbean taking Spanish prizes and accumulating treasure. Then, as they finally approached the North American coast in August 1590, disaster struck again. On August 15th, while attempting to land at Roanoke Island, one of the ship's boats capsized in the treacherous currents. 7 men drowned, including White's close friend and the expedition's navigator. The surviving sailors, spooked by the dangerous waters and eager to return to England with their Spanish treasure, wanted to abandon the mission entirely. But John White refused to give up. Not when he was so close. Not after 3 years of fighting to return to his family. On August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years after he had sailed away, John White finally set foot on Roanoke Island again. What he found there would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. The first thing White noticed was the smoke. As their boat approached the island, they could see smoke rising from the area where the colony should be. White's heart leaped with hope. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people were still there. They landed on the beach where White had said goodbye to his family 3 years earlier. The sailors fired their muskets and blew trumpets, making as much noise as possible to signal their arrival. They sang English songs that the colonists would recognize. There was no response. As they made their way inland, White saw signs that people had been there recently. Footprints in the sand, evidence of small fires. His hopes began to rise again. Maybe the colonists had simply moved inland. Maybe they were hunting or gathering food and would return soon. But when they reached the area where the settlement should have been, White's hopes turned to horror. The houses were gone. Completely gone. Not destroyed by fire or storm, but deliberately dismantled. The logs had been carefully removed, leaving only the outline of where buildings had once stood. It looked as though the colonists had taken apart their own homes. But for what purpose? To move them somewhere else? To use the wood for some other construction? Or had someone else taken them apart after the colonists were gone? White searched desperately for any sign of what had happened. Had there been a battle? Were their bodies buried somewhere? Had his family died of disease or starvation? Then he found the first clue. Carved into one of the posts of the palisade that had surrounded the settlement was a single word: CROATOAN. White stared at the carving, his mind racing. Before he had left 3 years earlier, he had made an agreement with the colonists. If they were forced to leave Roanoke Island, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or post. If they were in distress, they would also carve a cross. There was no cross above CROATOAN. White felt a surge of relief. CROATOAN was the name of a barrier island about 50 miles south of Roanoke, home to the CROATOAN tribe, Native Americans who had remained friendly to the English throughout the troubled years of the Lane Colony. Their chief, Manteo, had even traveled to England with earlier expeditions and had been baptized as a Christian. If the colonists had gone to CROATOAN Island, they might be safe. They might have integrated with the friendly tribe, living peacefully while waiting for White's return. But White needed to be sure. He searched the entire settlement area for more clues. Near the shore, he found another carving on a tree. CRO, apparently an unfinished version of CROATOAN. More importantly, White found evidence of what the colonists had taken with them. The heavy cannon and other military equipment had been buried. White found disturbed earth where they had been hidden. But many of the colonists' personal possessions were missing, suggesting they had time to pack and take their most precious belongings. This wasn't the scene of a hasty evacuation or violent attack. The colonists had left deliberately, with planning and preparation. White was now convinced his family was alive and waiting for him on CROATOAN Island. He rushed back to the ships, eager to sail south and finally reunite with Eleanor and Virginia after 3 long years. But fate had one more cruel twist in store. That night, a violent storm struck the coast. The ship's anchor cables snapped in the fierce winds, and they were blown out to sea. When dawn broke, they found themselves miles from shore with damaged equipment and dwindling supplies. The sailors, who had been reluctant participants in White's mission from the beginning, refused to attempt another landing. They had treasure from Spanish raids in their hold, and wanted to return to England before winter storms made the Atlantic crossing even more dangerous. John White faced the most heartbreaking decision of his life. He could insist on searching CROATOAN Island, risking the lives of the entire crew and possibly never making it back to England to organize a proper rescue mission. Or, he could return to England, knowing he was abandoning his family but hoping to organize a better-equipped expedition to find them. He chose to leave. As the coast of Virginia disappeared over the horizon for the second time, John White must have wondered if he would ever see his family again. He spent the rest of his life trying to organize another expedition to CROATOAN Island, but he never succeeded. John White died in Ireland sometime around 1593, never knowing what had happened to his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, or the 114 other colonists who had trusted him to return. But the mystery of their fate had only just begun. For nearly 2 decades after John White's final voyage, the fate of the Lost Colony remained a mystery that few had the resources or motivation to investigate. But in 1607, when the English established their first permanent settlement at Jamestown, the question of what happened to the Roanoke colonists took on new urgency. Captain John Smith, the legendary leader of Jamestown, became obsessed with solving the mystery. If the Roanoke colonists had survived, they could provide invaluable knowledge about living in the New World. If they had been killed, Smith needed to know by whom and why. The same fate could await his own colonists. Smith began gathering intelligence from local Native American tribes, and what he learned was both tantalizing and disturbing. According to Powhatan, the powerful chief who ruled much of coastal Virginia, some of the Roanoke colonists had indeed survived the initial years after White's departure. Powhatan claimed that they had settled at a place called Okanahoan, where they had lived for years, and even intermarried with local tribes. But then, according to Powhatan, something terrible had happened. Just before Smith's arrival in Virginia, Powhatan claimed he had ordered the massacre of the surviving Roanoke colonists. His reason? A prophecy had warned him that a white nation rising from Chesapeake Bay would destroy his empire. To prevent this prophecy from coming true, he had decided to eliminate any English presence in his territory. Smith was horrified, but also skeptical. Was Powhatan telling the truth? Or was this a story designed to intimidate the Jamestown colonists? Smith demanded proof, and Powhatan allegedly showed him English-made tools and weapons that he claimed had been taken from the dead colonists. But Smith never got the chance to fully investigate these claims. He was injured in a gunpowder explosion and forced to return to England in 1609, taking the secrets of what he had learned with him. In 1612, William Strachey, who had served as secretary of the Jamestown colony, published a detailed account that added new dimensions to the mystery. Strachey claimed that some of the Roanoke colonists had definitely survived into the early 1600s. According to his sources among the Virginia tribes, the survivors had split into two groups. One group had settled on Roanoke Island and lived there for about 20 years before being killed by hostile Native Americans during a period of drought and famine. The attackers had allegedly spared only 4 men, 2 boys, and 1 young maid, who were taken prisoner. The second group, Strachey claimed, had traveled south and west, eventually settling near the mouth of the Neuse River. These colonists had built European-style houses and had been living peacefully with local tribes for years. Most intriguingly, Strachey reported that some of these survivors had children, mixed-race descendants who could still be alive and walking around colonial Virginia. Strachey even claimed to know specific details about these survivors. They lived in houses with stone walls. They had domesticated animals, possibly livestock brought from England that had multiplied over the years. Some had even learned to work metal, creating tools and weapons that impressed their Native American neighbors. But, once again, before these claims could be investigated, the trail went cold. Strachey returned to England, and the pressing demands of survival in the harsh Virginia wilderness left little time for solving old mysteries. As the decades passed, the story of the Lost Colony began to take on mythic proportions, especially the tale of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, who would have been in her 20s if she had survived. Stories began circulating throughout colonial America about a beautiful young woman with pale skin and light hair living among the Native American tribes of North Carolina. Some claimed she had become a powerful medicine woman or even a chief's wife. Others said she had never fully integrated with tribal life and wandered the forest like a ghost, searching for her lost heritage. In 1709, explorer John Lawson traveled through the Carolina backcountry and reported meeting members of the Hatteras tribe, descendants of the CROATOANs, who claimed descent from the Roanoke colonists. These Native Americans, Lawson wrote, were different from others he had encountered. Some had gray eyes instead of brown, and several claimed that their ancestors had been able to talk in a book, meaning they could read and write. Lawson was convinced he had found evidence of the Lost Colony's survival, but his investigation was cut short when he was killed by hostile Native Americans in 1711, before he could document his findings more thoroughly. For the next 2 centuries, the mystery of the Lost Colony would be investigated by historians, treasure hunters, and amateur detectives, but always with the same frustrating result: tantalizing clues that seemed to lead somewhere important, only to dissolve into uncertainty and speculation. Part of the problem was the nature of the evidence itself. The Native American tribes of coastal Carolina had no written language in the 16th century. Their history was preserved through oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation through stories and songs. By the time serious investigators began trying to solve the mystery in the 1700s and 1800s, several generations had passed. The original witnesses were long dead, and the stories had been filtered through decades of retelling, mixing fact with legend, memory with imagination. Moreover, the very landscape where the drama had unfolded was changing rapidly. CROATOAN Island, where John White had hoped to find his family, was being steadily eroded by Atlantic storms. By the 1800s, much of the original island was underwater, taking with it any archaeological evidence of whether the colonists had ever been there. European diseases had also devastated the Native American populations of coastal Carolina. Entire tribes disappeared, taking their memories and stories with them. The CROATOAN people, who might have held the key to the mystery, had been scattered, absorbed into other tribes, or simply vanished from history. But perhaps the greatest obstacle to solving the mystery was the assumption that there had to be a single, simple answer to what happened to the Lost Colony. Investigators kept looking for evidence that all 115 colonists had met the same fate. that they had all been killed in a massacre, or all integrated with the same Native American tribe, or all died of the same disease? What if the truth was more complex? What if the colonists had split up, with different groups meeting different fates? What if some had been killed, others had integrated with various tribes, and still others had attempted the dangerous journey back to England? As we'll see, modern archaeology and DNA testing are beginning to suggest that this more complex scenario may be closer to the truth. But first, we need to examine the theories that have captivated investigators for over 400 years. Over the centuries, investigators have proposed dozens of theories about what happened to the Lost Colony. Some are based on historical evidence, others on archaeological discoveries, and still others on pure speculation. Let's examine the most compelling theories that have emerged. This is the theory that John White himself believed when he saw the word CROATOAN carved into the wooden post. The idea is simple. Faced with dwindling supplies and no sign of relief from England, the colonists decided to join the friendly CROATOAN people on Hatteras Island. The evidence supporting this theory is substantial. The CROATOANs had been allies of the English since the First Lane expedition. Their chief, Manteo, had been baptized as a Christian and given the title Lord of Roanoke by the English. If the colonists were going to trust any Native American group, it would be the CROATOANs. Moreover, the way the Roanoke settlement had been dismantled suggested careful planning rather than hasty evacuation. The colonists had time to take apart their houses, bury their heavy equipment, and pack their personal belongings. This sounds like people preparing to relocate to a new home, not fleeing from danger. Historical accounts from the early 1700s describe Hatteras Island residents who looked different from other Native Americans. Some with gray eyes, light skin, and European facial features. Some could allegedly speak a few words of broken English and claimed their ancestors had come from across the water. But there are problems with this theory too. When archaeologists have searched Hatteras Island for evidence of European settlement from the late 1500s, they found very little. Some metal artifacts that could be from the period, but nothing definitively linking the site to the Roanoke colonists. More troubling, Hatteras Island was a harsh environment for people accustomed to English agriculture. The island had no freshwater streams and very little land suitable for farming. Could 115 English colonists, including children and elderly people, have survived there long enough to integrate with the local population? Remember that John White's colonists were never supposed to stay on Roanoke Island permanently. Their original destination was Chesapeake Bay, where they planned to establish the city of Raleigh. What if they eventually completed their original mission? This theory suggests that after waiting for White's return for a reasonable period, perhaps a year or two, the colonists decided to continue with their original plan. They built boats or convinced friendly Native Americans to transport them north to Chesapeake Bay, where they established their settlement as originally intended. The evidence for this theory comes primarily from Captain John Smith's investigations in the early 1600s. Smith reported that Chief Powhatan claimed to know what happened to the Roanoke colonists. They had settled in his territory near Chesapeake Bay and lived there for years before he ordered them killed. Archaeological work in the Chesapeake Bay region has uncovered some tantalizing clues. Excavations at a site called Site X, identified through analysis of a map drawn by John White himself, have revealed European artifacts from the late 1500s, including pieces of lead, copper, and pottery that could have belonged to the lost colonists. But this theory also has significant problems. How would 115 people, including small children, have made the dangerous 200-mile journey from Roanoke Island to Chesapeake Bay? They would have had to travel through territories controlled by potentially hostile Native American tribes, cross multiple rivers and inlets, and do it all without the boats and supplies needed for such an expedition. Moreover, if they had successfully established a settlement in Chesapeake Bay, why didn't John Smith find more definitive evidence of their presence when he arrived in 1607? Why were there no European-style buildings, no clear signs of long-term settlement, no survivors who could tell their own story? The darkest theory about the Lost Colony is also one of the most historically plausible, that the colonists were killed by hostile Native American tribes, either soon after White's departure or after years of declining relations. Relations between English colonists and Native Americans were notoriously difficult throughout the colonial period. The Lane colony had already poisoned relationships with local tribes through arrogance and violence. Even if the white colony tried to maintain peaceful relations, cultural misunderstandings and competition for resources could have led to fatal conflicts. The evidence for this theory includes reports from multiple Native American sources that the colonists had been killed. Chief Powhatan told John Smith that he had ordered the massacre of survivors living in his territory. Other tribal leaders told similar stories to later investigators. Archaeological evidence of violence has been found at other colonial sites from the same period. The Jamestown colonists faced repeated attacks, and other early settlements were completely wiped out by Native American resistance. But the massacre theory also has significant weaknesses. If the colonists had been killed in a violent attack, wouldn't there be more evidence? Bodies, burned buildings, scattered artifacts showing signs of conflict? The careful dismantling of the Roanoke settlement doesn't look like the aftermath of a massacre. Moreover, why would hostile Native Americans carve CROATOAN into a post? If they had killed the colonists, they would be more likely to destroy all traces of English presence, not leave clues pointing to another tribe. Here's a theory that's often overlooked. What if the colonists tried to sail back to England on their own? By 1590, when John White finally returned, the colonists had been waiting for relief for 3 years. They might reasonably have concluded that England had abandoned them. Rather than risk starvation or conflict with Native Americans, they might have decided to build boats and attempt the dangerous Atlantic crossing themselves. The evidence for this theory is mostly circumstantial but compelling. The colonists included skilled craftsmen who could have built seaworthy vessels. They had taken apart their houses, possibly to use the wood for shipbuilding. They had buried their heavy equipment, suggesting they were planning to travel light. Spanish records from the late 1580s and early 1590s mention capturing small English vessels in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Could some of these have been boats built by the lost colonists? But this theory also faces serious challenges. Building ships capable of crossing the Atlantic would have required more than just carpentry skills. The colonists would have needed specialized knowledge of navigation, sailmaking, and maritime engineering that they probably didn't possess. Even if they had managed to build adequate vessels, the Atlantic crossing in the late 1500s was extremely dangerous, even for experienced sailors and well-equipped ships. The chances of 115 colonists, including children, surviving such a journey in homemade boats would have been very small. What if we've been approaching this mystery all wrong? What if there isn't a single answer because the colonists didn't all meet the same fate? This theory suggests that the lost colony split into multiple groups, each pursuing a different survival strategy. Some might have joined the Croatoans on Hatteras Island, others might have traveled to Chesapeake Bay to complete their original mission. A few might have attempted to return to England. Still others might have integrated with different Native American tribes throughout the region. This split colony theory would explain many of the contradictory pieces of evidence that have puzzled investigators for centuries. It would account for why John Smith heard reports of survivors in multiple locations. It would explain why archaeological evidence has been found in several different sites, but never in the concentrated way you'd expect from a single settlement. Modern DNA testing is beginning to support this more complex scenario, as we'll explore in our final section.